As the title implies, are Nick Claxton and Sharpe enough for the Nets at center position? Should they still be looking at the free agent market to address the need, for a big man under the basket? Or is this kind of all that this current squad needs in terms of big men going to break all of that down? But first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast and the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day, even here rolling through the off season. I am Doug Norrie, host of the Locked On Nets, also the owner of DFSR.com. If you need some projections, you know what to do. Go over to DFSR.com, FanDuel and DraftKings, all your daily fantasy needs. Got you covered over there. MLB rolling through that season. NFL right around the corner. Already started with the preseason there. Obviously with NBA, got it all covered for you at DFSR. No Adam Armbrecht on the show today. He's the host of the One Giant podcast. He's gearing up for football season as well. So go check out him and Andy Mack over on the One Giant podcast. Frankly, just crushing it. So if you're a Giants fan, which there's some chance there's an overlap between the Nets and the Giants, go check that out. If you want a new team to root for, go check out the One Giant podcast. Thanks for making Locked On Nets your first lesson of the day, free and available on all podcast platforms, YouTube as well. If you want to take a look at this mug, go over to YouTube for Locked On Nets. Got a ton to talk about here coming into the week. Obviously set it up for last time that Adam and I are going to go through the things that we would have changed about these last couple seasons for the Nets. Going to do a mailbag later on in the week as well. So go make sure you get your mailbag questions in. One of these is what we're going to talk about today is sort of mailbag related because it's come up from a bunch of different people over the last couple weeks, maybe even last week specifically. And that's talking about where the Nets stand when it comes to center on their roster right now. And I got a ton of thoughts about this. And, the question really boils down to, like we said at the opening, are Nick Claxton and Sharpe the true centers that are on the team right now? Are they enough for the Nets to go into the regular season with? And in some ways, this question is more layered than you would. It's not, I don't feel it's a clear yes or no on this one. I have definitely a way I'm leaning in this one, which we'll talk about. But I do think that there's factions of the NBA community and definitely within Nets fandom that still hold on to some traditional ideas around the center position and want to still field a team that looks on paper positionally like something that makes sense when you think about it, how people are labeled. And the way I mean by that is, typically with the NBA, we think of the traditional team as point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center, right? And for the most part, teams stick to that sort of ideal, stick to that rubric in terms of archetypes around their players. It's becoming increasingly, melded together because we have certain players that fit in to different positions, whether on offense, and they might play a different position on defense, or they're so versatile that they can do a bunch of different things. And in general, that's the kind of player you want on your team. But in terms of center, where the Nets are right now, and what I see a bunch of folks, and maybe you're out there like this too, saying to yourself, we need another center. We need a real center. We don't, Claxton and Sharpe aren't enough. We need a guy who can play center for this team. And I'm not sure that always takes into mind sort of what the center in the NBA has become and what it means to have a true center on your team and how far you can go, playoffs, championship, if you are relying on or paying a lot of money to a true center on a team. I'm going to put true center sort of in quotes there because I think even that definition is becoming increasingly difficult to sort of just, define. Definition that you define. For these purposes, I'm going to say a center is a unidimensional player, a one-dimensional large body that's pretty much needs to be around the basket to have any of their value around their skill set. I think Sharpe and Claxton, for the most part, fit that bill. Like they're not stretch bigs. Neither of them shoot threes all that well or at all. I mean, Sharpe has definitely tried during Summer League to do it. Maybe that's a part of his game that he eventually is able to bring on the NBA level. I have my doubts around that, but I do appreciate he's trying. But for our purposes, we'll say that Nick Sharpe, get these guys confused here. Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe are the two traditional centers on the team. Is it enough? Do they need to go into the free agent market still and sign another body to play on this team, independent of what happens with Kevin Durant, independent of if something happens with Kyrie? Like, is this the way they should be going? Because there's for sure a group of Nets fans out there that think that should be the case. I'm not sure I fit into that group. Now let's look at some stats from last year. Before we define like whether or not the Nets need to add another big body here, and I definitely will see a case for it. I'm going to outline a case for and against it. Let's talk about what Nets did not do very well last year. One thing that the Nets did not do all that well was keep opponents off the offensive glass. The Nets were one of the worst teams in the league when it came to opponent offensive rebounds, and we saw this happen tons of times during the season. It's all these second chance points, how much that other teams would get on the glass against the team, how many times it felt like the Nets had a good defensive possession only to have it even force a miss and then have the opposing team just, get an easy look under the basket. It looked like maybe people weren't boxed out. It looked like they had sort of open lanes when it came to just getting off the offensive glass. And that came out through the numbers. Nets ranks 27th in the league in opponents' offensive rebounds. Only 3 teams worse: Hornets, Spurs, and I think the Hornets was a transition thing. Spurs, we just know where their season went, and the Clippers, a wing-heavy team that had Zubac, and they had Hartenstein too, but that team was out-rebounded on the offensive end. But most of the teams sitting in the bottom of the league when it comes to opponent offensive rebounds are bad. I'll run down the bottom 8 here. The bottom 6. Thunder, obviously we know where they are. Rockets, we know them. Nets, okay. Hornets, all right. Spurs and Clippers. That's the bottom of the league when it comes to opponents' offensive rebounds. And then you can throw the Lakers and the Timberwolves in there as well. Maybe they're starting to get into better teams at that point. But we know the Nets got killed on the glass when it came. Now they got killed in the offensive glass. Overall opponents' rebounds, the Nets really weren't that bad. The Nets ranked about midway 13th in the league in terms of opponents' just total rebounds. That's because on the other side of the court, they didn't get killed on the defensive rebounding because they were really pretty good for the most of the season, pretty good on offense. When you make your shots, there's less available rebounds to be had for the opposing defense, right? So that just kind of makes sense on a math level, right? The Nets sort of sometimes had trouble stopping other teams. But then also on the other end, if you have Kevin Durant for part of the season hardened, if you have Kyrie Irving, if you have really, really good offensive talents, then you are just going to not allow as many rebounds for the other team to have. So was rebounding really a problem? Like this is because this is what people address when they want to get to whether or not they need another center. Are the Nets getting out rebounded? Yes, for sure. They're getting out rebounded on the offensive glass. On the defensive glass, not as much, because if you make your shots and if your team is built around offense like that, you don't need to have as much of a traditional center or a big body on your team, because if you make your shots on that end, then defensive rebounding is not going to be a problem. We saw some of this change when Drummond landed on the team as well. He gave them more of that traditional center body, that traditional, sort of one-dimensional-ish kind of guy. And we saw that some of that was cleaned up with him time in the court. He had his warts also. We saw them struggle on the defensive end with him. They couldn't really switch with him. The drop coverage became a real problem at times. With Drummond, these are some of the problems you introduce by having a traditional center like this on your team, is that, yes, you will control certain aspects of the game, the rebounding, but you will lose control of other aspects of the game, like your ability to really actively defend, your ability to have a functional switching defense if you want to really employ that in a heavy way, your ability to just stop other teams from getting good either threes or getting to the rim, because if you screw up your drop, those are going to be problems that are introduced. So I need people to think about this when they think about Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe is, okay, yes, what do the Nets maybe not do as well, but what do they maybe do better by having these two guys these two guys as their primary centers on the team? Because there's definitely a give and take here. It's not just as easy as saying, hey, we need a 7-footer to stand on the basket, to get into the post, to bang boards. I get it. I just went through the stats about why that's not a problem. But after this, I'll tell you why I think that in some ways, Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe are enough for what the Nets want to do, that they don't need to bring in one of these traditional centers, of which there are still plenty left. We'll go through the list here in a second. There are still plenty of these guys left on the market. Why? There's a reason for it. It's not because other teams don't need it. It's because this position, as we continue to think about it sort of historically compared to what it is now, it just doesn't work the same way anymore. And I think for some folks, they need to kind of get that out of their head, or at least have an updated view of what you need in the NBA. We will get into that here in a second. First, going to talk to you about our friends over at Built Bar. Built Bar Puffs. If you are not having these, you're depriving yourself of one of life's great joys. These Built Bar Puffs completely covered in chocolate, and they got the new flavor cookie dough chunk puff. It's got a light and chewy texture. It's got those real cookie. I know if you're fans of the cookie dough, you got to have the little chunks of cookie dough in there. That's kind of the whole payoff. The cookie dough chunk puff has it, 100% covered in chocolate. All the joy of eating cookie dough without the hassle of making it, which also going to be the problem too. Plus, it's healthy for you. Cookie dough chunk puffs are only 160 calories, have a whopping 15 grams of protein in them. Go to built.com, snag a box for you and the family. Perfect treat if you're on the go. Maybe you just want to keep them for yourself. No problem there. I've done that around our house for sure. Go to built.com. You're going to use the promo code LOCKED15. Grab those cookie dough chunk puffs. You're going to get 15% off of your order with LOCKED15. Go to built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off of your order. Built.com. All right. Is it enough? Are these two guys enough? Do we need to sign another center? Let's look through the guys, the players that are still available that we will put under the just center tag as available still on the free agent market as of recording this late Sunday, heading into Monday. Okay. A couple good names we're going to definitely be familiar with. Lamarcus Aldridge is still out there. We saw what Lamarcus Aldridge could do for the team. Definitely, they relied on his scoring at times last year. He's 37 years old. He was completely buried at the end of the season. No indication that he's going to be coming back. I'm not going to read the whole list. Another guy that's gotten thrown out there, Boogie Cousins, DeMarcus Cousins, 32 years old on the Nuggets last season. I know people want to sort of fall in love with what Boogie can do. At one point, he was like sort of one of the premier talents. Injuries have cost him. He's getting up there in age. Hard to keep him on the court for long periods of time. He can shoot the three. He does offer a little bit of stretch big stuff. Squinting, you can see it maybe with Cousins, right? Like, can you play him 25 minutes a game? No chance. But can he do a little bit of like what Drummond did last year and then also stretch the floor a little bit? I guess so. And I can see why people would want to talk themselves into Cousins. I'll talk about why that's maybe problematic here in a second. Other guys, I'll just roll through this list. Ed Davis. Okay. We know the name. Do we want him back here at 33? Probably not. Montrez Harrell, he's dealing with some legal issues right now, which I'm not sure are going to get ironed out prior to the season. Then they got Dwight Howard. That's a name that's come up among Nets chatter. I would say he's 37 years old. We know exactly what Dwight Howard is. He's going to be able to get on the boards a little bit. How much is he going to cost you in other areas of the game? Probably some. Myers Leonard's still out there. Tristan Thompson's still out there. Hassan Whiteside's seen his name bandied about a little bit. Cody Zeller out there as well. So these guys all fit traditional center, positions. They can only play center on offense and they can only guard centers on defense. So they're centers. That's that point stop. That's what they are. The reason you can't, the start of the reason why we should maybe consider Claxton and Sharpe sort of enough for the team right now as they're currently constructed are a couple different reasons. The first is we know that as positions are made up in the NBA, we'll call them 1 through 5, point guard through center, point guard 1 all the way up through 5 center. You lose some of your malleability on the team by having guys on your team that can only play one of those positions unless they are so dynamic at what they do that it overshadows everything else. No one I've mentioned there on that list has any of those skills, so I think we can put that away, right? An example of that would be like, hey, we always thought of James Harden and Kyrie Irving as kind of each point guards, let's say. They could play together because both of them were so unbelievable at offense that it does away with some of the problems. That does away with some of the problems on the other end. It's very rare to be able to do that with centers, like a 5. The farther you get into on the spectrum of positions, the harder it is for you to play with players of only that and part of that spectrum. That's why threes, like wings, are so valuable, especially wings that are good at offense. Kevin Durant, Kawhi Leonard, LeBron James, Paul George. The list goes on and on. It's basically, Giannis, he's not even a wing, but he's just so unbelievable. All these guys that can check multiple boxes that you can't really put a position on them, they become super valuable. Center's not like that. We know right now to sign another center, to add them to the team, would mean not being able to play the other centers you have. Okay, that's okay if you think your other guys aren't good enough, but they're all going to come with their warts. All of these guys are going to have problems. They're all one-dimensional because they're just fives. When you're only a five, you are a one-dimensional player. How do we know this? We saw this play out exactly with the Nets last season. We saw it right away where they had problems, among other things with their roster, is they had a roster near the end filled with guys that couldn't play with each other. Lamarcus, Blake Griffin, Claxton could not play each other. They needed little bits of skills from each one of them, but in terms of playing together, they really could never do that. I think they tried it a few times with those guys. It was mostly bad, and for the most part, you don't want to do it. To sign another center would come at the cost of being able to play those other guys and at the cost of having a one-dimensional aspect of these guys' game that will probably give away other stuff. So do you want to start filling your roster with centers that can never play together? I don't. This is the part of the reason I start to say this is enough for what the Nets need right now. Because are Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe perfect NBA centers? No. Obviously, they have problems. All these guys do. They all have problems. We're not talking about Jokic. We're not talking about Embiid. We're not talking about you want to throw Giannis into the center conversation. Even a guy like DeAndre Ayton, you put in the traditional center, does enough on both ends of the court to make it not as problematic to have him, closing games in big spots. The list is pretty short here, though, folks. A lot of Robert Williams is in there. He's so good at defense that you are okay with it, right? I've seen Al Horford thrown out there as a stretch big. That makes sense too, but they still played those guys together. The Warriors closed with Kevon Looney. Look, they're going to be able to get away with that. Him and Draymond Green, because the rest of the offense is so dynamic that they can, and he can hold his own on switches, that it's not going to be as big of a problem, that they don't have maybe, more versatile big and they can run with a traditional center. But for the most part, you're only going to be able to play one of these guys, and you just need to decide which skill set you think you need the most from them. Because again, you're not getting anyone that has like a really dynamic skill set around this is already pretty much taken and probably is overpaid at this point. Jonas Valanciunas is a good example of this. Like these guys are already pretty much not even overpaid, but they're just anyone that has that kind of dynamic ability on both ends of the court or is really, really good on offense, let's say, is already spoken for. These are not the guys that we're talking about. So I think the Nets fans need to start thinking about this and like, what are you getting? What do you really want? You just want someone that can rebound? Hey, they had that with Drummond already. Drummond played pretty well. We already saw what can happen with this kind of guy. Is this what you want by just throwing a center out there just to say you can do it? I would contend that maybe not. Like maybe this is not how we need to be thinking about the center position right now. That we don't need to think about it in these traditional pieces, or just don't want to just have our eyes pointed directly at the glass and say, hey, we don't have a guy there. Now, we shouldn't just give up on it. We got to develop, players that can do both things and be a little bit more malleable and have just a more all-around game for sure. And maybe that's more of a problem with like the overall development. They haven't gotten one of these guys yet. But again, it's not like these guys are just growing on trees. It's not like these guys are just all out there. Guys who can switch, guys who aren't going to be put in really bad defensive situations, guys that can also hit the glass, guys that have enough of an offensive game, soft enough hands going to the rim, can read and react. Like there's a lot of boxes you need to check. I'm almost always going to default to athleticism over just a big body that can just get up and down the court. And that's where I start to land with the Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe thing is like, now that we're here with these two guys, does it make sense to continue thinking about just signing on a center just to say you have it? And I don't think that it does. We'll talk about that here in a sec. All right, final thoughts here on where we are. And you can see where I'm leading, I think. I think you can see where this is going in terms of, this talk about a traditional five, this talk about adding a Dwight Howard or Boogie Cousins or Hassan Whiteside or a guy like this, is that what they have in Day'Ron Sharpe, and specifically what they have in Claxton right now, is sort of an upside that the other guys don't have, that these other bigger guys don't have. The one thing I will say, the one like sort of advantage of having a bigger guy like this during the regular season is they can just eat innings, and that probably is an important thing for you as an NBA team. You don't want to send like Ben Simmons into the play Ben Simmons at center, let's say, for an entire season, because that's just going to be so taxing on his body that by the end of the season, the juice won't be worth the squeeze in terms of what you put him through on the defensive end. And at that point, I do think signing an innings eater kind of guy is that's the case I can make for it. Do I want to get out there and play 15 minutes a game and bang some bodies and grab some boards? And it's kind of second unit stuff. Yeah, I can see it. That's like the one case for doing it. But otherwise, in this terms of this NBA and in terms of what I think the Nets are trying to construct in terms of what personnel they have, whether they bring back Durant or not, this is probably Durant independent, and let we know, and whoever it's going to be in terms of the team, what kind of player do they need? I would default toward athleticism, sort of just energy, and doing some defensive stuff well, and at the cost of some of the boards. And I think that's what you're going to get with Nick Claxton. Now, look, is Claxton a perfect center? No. They paid him here in the offseason a little bit. They certainly are hoping that he is able to develop into more of a dynamic player than they've seen so far. And I think we saw signs of that from Claxton last season. He does not have a ton of size on the body. I think that's okay if you're going to be able to do the other things he does really well. He's able to switch really well. He's able to hold up against much smaller players on the perimeter. He's got a lot better last season around finishing around the basket and having a better touch around the basket. That was a clear sign of growth for him last season. If we can continue on that trajectory for him, then I think that we'll probably eliminate a lot of the Claxton questions going forward. We're not going to get the outside game from him really going all that much, I don't think, at any point. I don't think we need to start, wishing on that. But we do know he can put the ball on the floor. He played that a lot in college. Like, he can, dribble, let's say. He can initiate things from that point of view. Are you going to be able to have him bang bodies with a Joel Embiid, for 48 minutes a game, or not that many, a lot of minutes a game? No, but again, what are you getting instead? Because most times what you're going to send that guy out to do that is just to get to body Embiid, probably foul him a lot. And that's like one guy that you're doing that against. A lot of the other teams, you're not really being asked to do that on sort of a defensive in the post thing anyway. You'd rather have a versatility when it comes to a switching scheme. And we know Claxton gives you that. Are there questions around the fit with him and Ben Simmons? Yes, but here's the thing. Those problems will exist in any of the other guys that I just mentioned, except for maybe, like I said, Cousins, who can stretch the floor a little bit. For the most part, I'm not even making a case for Cousins here. Like, I'm saying he probably does exist in a little bit of a different standing than some of those other guys. But again, like, what are you really getting there? So all these other guys I mentioned are going to have the same problems with Simmons too, which is one of the big sort of detractions I see from Claxton folks now, is that, what's going to happen when you put him with Simmons? Guess what? That's going to be the same thing with all these guys. All these guys that are just big bodies that need to stand inside the restricted area to have any value is going to be a problem with Simmons anyway. So I don't think you can use that as a knock against Claxton if you're trying to look for the centers that are still remaining. Okay, if you're looking for the big guys that are still remaining, would Simmons benefit from a guy who could stretch the floor? Of course. These guys don't exist within the traditional mold that we're still looking at. You have to start going down to like more power forward types. And even these guys are probably too small for what Nets fans want anyway. And that's like Blake. We just saw it. I'm trying to Millsap, that doesn't really fit. A lot of these other kind of traditional power forward guys are just too small. So that group outside of, I don't know, they just don't exist. Maybe Myers Leonard, but I think you're still running into the issues of where you thought, where the Nets are dealing with lack of size. So I would say on that end, I'm of the camp that I'd just rather see what it looks like with Claxton and Simmons. And at that point, address it later in the season if you think it's a problem. So in terms of like what we know, that there might be some lane clogging, there's going to be lack of spacing. Let's work with the idea. Okay, well, we know they're going to get sort of elite perimeter / switching defense with these two guys. will develop a lot of chaos. There's going to be a lot of transition with those two guys on the defensive end because they're so long and fast and have good instincts that they will open up opportunities going the other way. I think for that, I just rather just see it because I know what I'm getting with the guys that are still on the market. I know that already. And then with Day'Ron, he's still so raw that I do think he'll be able to do some of the things that Nets fans want in terms of a traditional center. We already know he's unbelievable on the offensive glass, like in terms of just strictly per numbers, per minute offensive rebounding. In his limited minutes last season was among the best in the league. Small sample size, but we know that that's the case with him. So he kind of does cure up that one part of it, like where the Nets didn't really offensive rebound all that well. Sharpe does address some of that. He is a bigger body. It looks like he thinned out a little bit in the offseason when we saw him play during Summer League. He's listed at 265. I'd actually be a little surprised if he was still at that number. He looked like he had really trimmed down on the body and the frame just from the Summer League stuff. Like he looked quicker. It didn't always work out for him in Summer League, but he might have given up a few pounds to sort of get back some quickness. I'm totally fine with that. We saw him try the 3-pointer in Summer League, maybe trying to get into a point where he's a stretch 5. There's so much that needs to happen for that to really happen, but I appreciate the effort. So I think with the Nets fans, for what they're looking for in terms of a center right now, I think most of it is here already on the team. And adding it now would only be at one, the expense of developing what they already have, and two, just making it so that we probably get an iteration of the Nets that we already know it would be like. They'll do some things well. They'll get it on the glass. They'll be able to body up some of the bigger bodies. That's fine. Do they really need that like long term to be like a championship level team? Not really. Because for the most part, unless you're super dynamic, who is the list of guys that are out there in the NBA that are one-dimensional, just big centers that are playing huge minutes for really good teams? Who is it? What's the list? Please tell me the list. Let's know what it is. I'm talking about the guys who remain that are just traditional centers, or that are on good teams that are just only do one thing really, really well, which is like stand under the boards and grab rebounds. Those guys are few and far between, and the great teams don't really have them and don't really employ them. They have to be able to do other things. And I think that's where sometimes folks get confused with the center position. And I know why they want it. It's a traditional thing. If you've been following basketball forever, the movement away from centers is still mostly pretty new. Like it's mostly on the timeline of basketball. This is a relatively new piece of the puzzle, but this is the way it's going. And in terms of just adding a body just to say you have a center in the team, I just don't think it's something that Nets need to address with any sort of, energy right now. And it's definitely not something that they need to overextend themselves, because I think the downsides are just there, and it just limits you in a lot of other ways. So are Nick Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe enough for the Nets? For me, right now, with what's left on the market, I would say they definitely are. And maybe it's something that they need to think about addressing with a more sort of complete player later on. But that's really not the discussion that we're having. We're talking about who is left in free agency. All right. Later on this week, got a bunch of big stuff coming. Adam and I are going to talk about the moments from the last couple of seasons from the Nets that we would love to just have a do-over. We'll each do one of them. Encourage you to throw out your ideas for those as well. We'll spend an episode on each, kind of go back and forth about maybe what would have happened with this team had one moment in time not been there for the Nets. Also got a mailbag coming. So we've already got a bunch of questions in. Really appreciate it. Make sure you throw in a question on YouTube as well. If you want to just get a question for the mailbag, because we'll do that later in the week. Also, make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Free way to just help the podcast. Really appreciate all the subs that we've gotten for YouTube. And make sure you like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts as well. Both of those two things are free, and they are the number one ways to help us. Adam's the one that usually rolls us out with a quote. It's right around now that I remember. This is how I take Adam for granted, because it's right around now that I remember that I was supposed to have fired up a quote from one of the great American poets. Adam's not here, so we didn't do it. Blew it on that end, but we will be back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.